Well, fake news is, first of all, it's nothing new. It's been around a long time. It just, with the prevalence of social media, I think it's just manifested itself in a much greater extent than what we have seen. But in a minute, we can talk about the difference in bias versus fake news. But fake news involves these stories that come out, and the majority of them are preposterous when you read it. And we all know about the Washington restaurant that was the target of fake news story that evolved from there, and bad situation. There are some of these that where a 9-year-old accidentally discovers a cure for cancer, where there was one that came out about President Obama was going to ban the Pledge of Allegiance. Stories that on them just by their merits are outrageous, and there are some that are not quite as egregious as that are easily they're not as easily detectable, but it is just someone who is in essence fabricate a story, and it comes across, and because someone sees it, they believe it, and then it spreads on social media. Mm-hmm. It does manifest itself in a number of ways, but it is in some fake news is much more difficult to determine, because it can have a basis in fact, but something has been distorted or something has been absolutely altered, and that came out especially involving Donald Trump. Some statements about and stories that came out about Ford moving production from Mexico to Ohio. That was a 2015 story, and it did have a basis in fact, but then some of the fake news stories that came out made it as though it was a present day situation, that it had and that he had done that when he actually had no involvement in that whatsoever in the 2015 situation. So fake news also, because it comes from various domain sites that are not reputable. There is also an element of fake news that doesn't have that dramatic an impact, but I'll give you a good example. The Only in Your State website that so many people have seen, and they'll list, these are the top 10, fill in the blanks. And some of those stories are fake news. They're written by people who've never been to the state or to the communities, and they have no basis in fact. So we used to call some of those stories urban legends, and you'll still see some of those on emails, and they seem somewhat preposterous when you read them. And that's a good way which we can talk about to detect, is this fake news? How do you detect those? Mm-hmm. But again, they've been around for a long time, but with social media and internet and so many new sites coming on board, they seem to have proliferated in these recent days.
Mm-hmm. Let's talk about that then, because that is one of the things that I think it's important is helping people. So how does the person who's scrolling through Facebook, mm-hmm. how do they detect what story is a fake news story?
Well, I think one thing that you have to realize is we are impacted by a fake news story that confirms our beliefs, that confirms either our political beliefs or our spiritual beliefs. And if we see a story that focuses on something that we really is serious to us, it grabs our attention. So if you see one of those stories, and again, if it's outrageous, you sure need to be careful on it. But be careful about if you're directed to a URL, to a domain name, and look at the domain name. For instance, abcnews.com is a legitimate, very good news source. There is a site, abcnews.com.co, which is not, and which proliferates fake news. So check the website, check the URL to make sure that's one that you recognize. If you see something and if it grabs your attention, it's always good to Google that phrase and to see have any reputable organizations, whether that be the Washington Post, whether that be CNN, have they got that story? If you don't see it, then you know that's not true. I found one that was last week, and I went to a reputable site, and I had a pop-up that came on. Well, it was about Kellyanne, and it said Kellyanne Conway resigns her office to begin work with an anti-aging skin cream. And obviously that was a fake news. So, but I thought, well, maybe did she, And so I went to the AP, and I Googled it, and nobody else had that story. So obviously that's fake news. There's also varied websites that will check stories for you. Snopes.com, SNOPES. There's various fact checkers. I think it's factchecker.org. Washington Post has a good fact check. So when you see something and you think, I don't know if that's factual, you can go to those sites and just Google it and see if anybody else is reporting that. And you also have to be careful about pictures that can be used and that may be used out of context. So those, and it's always good to click those images and see is anybody else using that image in a news story.
Do you ever see times when the mainstream media sources are doing things that may be just a touch, like that, like using a picture out of context, things like that?
At the risk of offending some of my newspaper peers, I think we need. It is not easy, but it does happen where a newspaper is duped, where they are conned. All reputable ones will acknowledge that as quickly as they can, and they will correct that. I think the problem gets to this is the bias that any news operation has can influence itself in how they report things, in the prominence they give to those things. I have seen, we have a great example, this was years ago, probably 12 years ago or so, we received an obituary and about someone dying overseas. Well, it was somebody had duped us. We printed it, and of course that changed our policy of how we're going to accept obituaries, which is embarrassing, but the first thing we did was we put it out in every way possible that this was false. I do see the major media that their bias shows in how they report on things, and to those of us who are in the conservative realm, that's very troubling. And I see it especially as it relates to political coverage of the abortion issue. I see that sometimes, from my perception, from perhaps my bias, that those facts are skewed in the wrong way. I wouldn't call that fake news, but I would call that a bias that does not present the whole story.
Okay. Do you think that it can be, sometimes it's not just what is written or reported, it might even be in what's withheld?
That is correct. And that's where we fall into that bias category. Richard Nelson with Commonwealth Policy Center had a great op-ed piece about the Women's March in Washington and all the play that got among the major media, and yet what was not. And you especially see it. Tell you what's really troubling to me. TV news especially will go to interview people about an issue, and they'll go into a bar and ask someone, well, does that give you a representative sample of what America feels about things? I see that major media tends to, what they would call balance, to me sometimes goes the other way. From my perspective, it seems like the liberal agenda always has its say. I'm not sure that the conservative agenda does. I don't think the conservative agenda does. And I do see what is withheld. That's why the issues of faith, to me, are very important in our newspaper, because faith community's viewpoint is often hidden from the overall public. And whenever those stories do make those national, oftentimes it's in a unflattering light.
It seems like one of the things that you haven't said directly, I've heard this tone, and maybe I'm putting words in your mouth, but it sounds like a suggestion you would make is go as local as you can.
Yes, I agree with that. It does trouble me that, especially your major news organizations, that they've got such access to great sources, yet they often don't utilize those. Locally, when the old political statement that all politics is local, that's true, and all news is local. It needs to have a local connection, and in my perspective, local people are who are going to hold you accountable. Those are the people that you see at church or in the grocery store or at the football or basketball game. And if you're not being fair, you're going to hear about it. And that's where that bias, I think, comes into play.
Because the folks around here know where you stand because they know you.
Right.
How do we keep that mindset when we think about the reporter standing outside of the White House on that national scene?
Well, if I don't know how that's going to happen, but if anything shows the necessity of that happening, it is the Trump election, to where the national media was so out of tune, so disconnected to the American public. And I found it very interesting as I watched NBC on election night. They were asking that question themselves, how could we have missed this? How could we have missed this? Well, it's because you're in your ivory tower and you really have not talked to people, and you really have no accountability to people. Your accountability has been to the people in the main offices of your network and to shareholders, but you've not been accountable to the general public. And from my perspective, they are not interested in hearing what the general public has to say, because they think they are an elite, and we call them media elite. And there is a media elite in this country. And for those of us who are in the hinterlands laboring away, that's troubling. We feel like certainly, I go to Washington, D.C. every March to lobby for newspaper issues. And the biggest challenge that we have is to say, hey, I'm not the Washington Post. I'm not the New York Times. I think I have my pulse on what the people in rural Kentucky, in rural America, have to say. And it's hard to get, especially those younger staffers in Washington, to make that distinction between the people that they see in those major media and for them to see the local media for what it is.
That's good. That's good. It's you have anything you want to add? That's super.
No, if that's okay with you.
No, that's great. So it's kind of, and I'm